saying something similar, that the terms get change meanings over time. So Confederate is what we think of now as federal. Is that
I'll
right?
explain that when
Okay.
I get
Generally.
kind of to the solutions, yes, but you're right. So this large republic notion, and I want to get through this and then we'll go back. It flips the wisdom, because the thought was that in order to have a republic, everybody had to know everybody. They had to be within speaking distance. They had to be like New Hampshire is, you know, with your local self-government. That's not going to work too well in California. But there are different areas. They have different approaches to life based on their cultural background. That is a notion of republicanism. Republicanism is all about governing self. The large republic notion is that we're going to have too many people with different views who are not going to get along in this country. So part of the other solution to the problem of faction is not only that you multiply factions, but you spread them out. You spread them out so that they can't communicate well with one another. Now that worked fine until radio, television, and the internet. And now what do we get? We get exactly what they predicted, which was we get a lot of people screaming at each other because they have different viewpoints. Think about this. Congress, we're always told by the polls, is held in very, 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 very low esteem, right? Well, why is it that people keep electing their member of Congress? Because most of them will tell you, my member of Congress is fine, it's just all those other people. Well, why those other people? Those other people are liked by their constituents. The reality is, you wouldn't get along well with people in those other areas. By having a large republic, you allow the many different viewpoints and factions to fan out across the country. Again, technology today presents a severe challenge to that part of the solution. Okay. But the structural solution, point two, about separation of powers and federalism. I talked a little bit about federalism. I'll come back to it to answer your question. But separation of powers is actually the point on which they most agreed, although they still differed, more so than federalism. And indeed, you see if you look at Supreme Court cases, many, many cases over the 200 plus years have involved federalism issues. Often people don't see that these same cases also involve separation of powers issues, but they're not aware of them. Separation of powers was a principle that both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists agreed on, and it was taken most directly from Montesquieu. It has an earlier origin. Montesquieu thinks it comes from England. People debate as to whether he's accurate on that. But in any event, Montesquieu is the source. But we had the experiment of the state constitutions, and the Massachusetts state constitution, which goes back to what, 1780, right? Nobody here from Massachusetts. Anyway, in the Constitution, it actually says and proclaims the term separation of powers, and this is the principle. If you look at the U.S. Constitution, you will not see that term. Instead, what you will see is the working out of it. It is as if you have the architecture's explanation of what happened in the Federalist, and then you have the blueprint in the Constitution. Why did they do that? Because in the states, including Massachusetts, they thought they were implementing the principle of separation of powers. In the view of the framers of the Constitution, they failed. Because they said they implemented in principle, but it didn't work in practice. Why didn't it work in practice? Because they did nothing to check the legislative branch, and de facto the legislature ended up riding roughshod over the courts and over the governor. And in Pennsylvania, they didn't even have a governor. So they looked on these state constitutions as experiments, but flawed experiments. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists disagree on the detail of how separation of powers is to occur, but they agree that without separation of powers, there is no liberty. That is a critical point that I'll come back to in the next when we go through the change bit. How does this work? Well, first of all, you have to understand what Madison said in terms of the legislature. I'm going to read to you a little bit from Federalist 48. quote, "The legislative branch is everywhere extending the sphere of its activity and drawing all power into its impetuous vortex." Then he goes on to say, "It is against the enterprising ambition of this department that the people ought to indulge all their jealousy and exhaust all their precautions. The branch they are most worried about is the legislative branch." That's the key to understanding this. And so, but you've got lots of conservatives out there who think that the role of the court is to defer to the Congress. That's nonsense. It's not to easily trump the Congress, to go out of its way to find things, but there's not a principle of deference there at all. It's a principle of the court holding everybody to the text of the Constitution. And without that, they're going to say there is in fact no liberty. Now, the solution of separation of powers involve this. If it's not working in the states, what do we have to do? If the legislative is the most powerful, their solution is basically this. You cut the 800-pound gorilla in half. You divide the legislature to weaken it. And you strengthen the other two branches. In other words, our separation of powers is an artificial creation of equality where inherently, or by nature in a democratic republic, the legislature must be naturally the most powerful. Now, members of the media never get this, otherwise they would not say what they repeatedly say whenever the same party controls the executive in both houses of Congress. Now they say gridlock is going to end. It's not going to end. It's not going to end. By design. So they create the two houses not only as separate, but as being based on separate principles and being totally designed, they say, to have as little in common as possible, only enough to make it possible ultimately to pass legislation. And remember, Madison says, look, this system will prevent some good laws from being passed, but it will prevent a lot more bad laws from being passed. So when people say we have a do-nothing Congress, Madison would say, great, except what they're not doing is the one thing they're supposed to do, which is to get a budget. They don't seem to be able to do that. Okay, on federalism, your question. Our Constitution redefines all kinds of terms simply because of its success. So federal, confederal at the time meant the same thing, like flammable, inflammable. In the Federalists, they use the terms interchangeably. And our system, they don't even they originally call it a confederal republic. But then in Federalist 39, they say but they say in truth, what we have is a compound republic. Partly national, partly federal. See, this is not a states' rights system, as a lot of conservatives think. It's not. The states have residual sovereignty in certain areas, but certain important areas are simply taken away from the states. They have no power in that. So when people say the states are sovereign, that's an incorrect statement. The states have residual sovereignty. And what is that? The basics of sovereignty are four: national defense, foreign affairs, taxation, and police power. Those are the elements of sovereignty.
Can you repeat those? I'm sorry.
National defense, foreign affairs, taxing power, and police power. Right? The first two are taken away from the states. States can still have militia, but the president has ultimate control over them. They're gone. Article 1 blocks the states from having any kind of foreign relations powers. And you think states wouldn't do that, but they will. And one time, Louisiana, back in the heyday of oil, went pretty close to it when they invited all the OPEC nations to New Orleans. That looked pretty funny. I was in a conference in Arizona where it was proposed by lawyers that there be a treaty between Arizona and Mexico. I thought, wait a minute, you can't do that. They knew what they were doing. Confederal organizations in the past had broken up, had blown up. In fact, Yugoslavia, Slovenia, before the blow-up, had its own foreign ministry. That's crazy. So those two are taken away from the states. The taxing power is a concurrent power. Both governments have that power. If you don't have taxing power, you really don't have much of a federal state. I have a friend who keeps telling me, he's a law professor in Argentina, he keeps saying, our Constitution is just like yours. I said, no, it's not. And you can look at Argentina, and they call themselves a federal state, but you would know simply from the size of Buenos Aires it's not a federal state. Why? That's a unitary state when all power sucks into one city. You can tell the U.S. is federal because we spread power. We have all these states, and we have different power structures in each state reflected by state capitals. Some are more powerful than others. But think of all the big cities we have in this country. On the other hand, look at France, look at Mexico, look at Argentina, where all power sucks to the middle. Power and population money go to where the power is. Why? In Argentina, the states have no taxing power. You don't have any taxing power, you're not federal.